Dear shareholders, today we're going to be talking about art. And not just any art, public art. And to be even more specific, how this and this killed Calgary's public art program for 6 years. Now, since all of us taxpayers are equal shareholders in public art in the city, I figure now would be a good opportunity to have a conversation about arts funding, urban construction, and the notion of quality. Let's talk about it. So in my telling of the story, I'd like to take you back to November of 2007, which is when Calgary City Council officially approved the extension to the 96th Avenue Northeast roadway. And this project was important for a few reasons. First, it allowed residents of North Central Calgary to better access Deerfoot Trail, which is a major north-south freeway here in the city named after the inimitable Siksika long-distance runner Epi Kais. Second, it allowed the development of the Aurora Business Park, which sits just north of the Nose Creek Parkway. And third, it allowed the city to introduce a new public transit line taking residents from downtown Calgary up past Centre Street and past Country Hills Boulevard and out to the airport in the northeast. Now, unless you happen to live in Harvest Hills or one of the surrounding communities that benefited from this improved infrastructure, chances are high that it would have likely faded from the public consciousness and would have hardly been considered newsworthy when it was completed back in August of 2013. But it wasn't, because 4 months later, all of Calgary's eyes were upon the site when this happened. Giant Blue Ring, Traveling Light, is an 18-meter high tour de force in art and industrial design, form and function, simplicity and profundity. It's nestled atop the 96th Avenue overpass, filling passing pedestrians and motor vehicles alike with awe and illumination through a functional streetlight blooming from its apex.
Referring to the artist statement behind the piece, Traveling Light is meant to provide a visual abstraction of the themes of motion and transportation, in reference to the nearby airport and CP rail directly behind me. It also references the extensive highway network, which allows a lot of Calgarians to move amongst the city. Its grand scale also provides a visual landmark and challenges motorists' perspective as they drive past.
But alas, Calgarians didn't seem to see it that way. In fact, many of them took in droves to the internet to voice their own perspective on the piece, in the same manner that you might visit a modern art museum and think to yourself, why, my 6-year-old could have painted that. Even Calgary's mayor at the time was quoted calling the piece awful, although he did have the good grace at the end to add a caveat acknowledging that sometimes art can be divisive.
And yes, although time has somewhat softened the edges around our reaction to this piece, and 10 years out it now sits at a 2.4 on Google reviews, the fact remains that many of us continue to be annoyed by this piece of artwork, not just by its aesthetic simplicity, but also due to the fact that it cost us taxpayers quite a pretty penny at $471,000.
This is only the beginning of the story though, because 4 years later in 2017, the Bowfort Road and Highway 1 interchange project was officially completed in the city's northwest. And this project allowed for free-flowing, uninterrupted traffic to and from the city, as well as improved access to COP and Winsport athletic facilities, while spurring economic development in nearby communities.
Which again, would have faded into relative obscurity if not for the unveiling of this piece of public art behind me back in the summer of 2017 along the Bowfort Road interchange.
Triassic Towers, or Bowfort Towers, is a series of 4 sets of iron oxidized cordon steel frameworks suspending 8 slabs of Rundle stone in the air, nestled on a narrow patch of grass between the Trans-Canada Highway and the off-ramp leading into Winsport and Canada Olympic Park.
The structure itself was inspired by a local Canmore geologist's personal collection of Rundle rock originating from 225 million years ago. And if you get up close and actually look at the rock, which I won't because I'm on the edge of the highway and the off-ramp just here, you can find that there are marks of water and ammonite remains and other marks of life that would have existed on this part of the planet during a period of otherwise mass extinction. The poles themselves are symmetrically triangulated in 15-degree angles, which provides viewers a sense of rotation as you drive past. And altogether, it's supposed to represent this feeling of having sentinels, which connect the earth below to the heavens above. In reference to their consultation with Indigenous groups during the design phase of this construction, the artist collective referred to the number 4 being important in that regard, and altogether, it's actually not meant to be an abstract piece of artwork. Far from it, in fact, given this province's rich geological history, as well as the continued importance that Alberta places on extracting resources from the earth.
But once again, Calgarians would have none of it, and it was lambasted universally across social media and news platforms alike. This time around, Mayor Nenshi was quoted stating, "Sometimes statues of a guy or a gal on a horse can be really nice." Not only that, there was additional controversy when the Joint Chiefs of Treaty 7 territory got together and formally declared that this was not a reflection of Indigenous culture. Moreover, artists from Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani sent a formal letter to the city admonishing the piece as being cultural theft and being an offensive imitation of Indigenous burial traditions.
There was actually the intention to have a secondary accompanying piece of artwork in this location, consisting of what they called drumlin earthworks, or the markings left behind after glaciers had moved through. Taken together, it was supposed to provide the sense of gravity and time as you move westward out into the Rocky Mountain Range and eastward into the city. But alas, it wasn't meant to be, because after $411,000 was committed to the project, and after they found they had a shortfall of $120,000 to complete the drumworks portion, the project was ultimately scrapped, and it remains incomplete to this day according to its original design. Not soon afterwards, Calgary City Council got together and unanimously voted to formally suspend Calgary's public art program.
Going through common complaints that Calgarians have about our city's public art program, I identified 3 major complaints. Let's go through them one by one. Point 1. Public art is too expensive, and that money can be better spent elsewhere. So when Travelling Light and Bowfort Towers were initially constructed, they were done so in reference to Calgary Recreation's 2004 Corporate Public Art Policy, which is the preeminent body and governing document concerning the funding and maintenance of public art in the city. Calgary employs the percent for public art allocation, which is tied to eligible capital projects costing over $1 million, where 1% of upgrade, growth, and service budget items must be set aside for public art. There's actually precedence for the percent for public art policy, and it's somewhat standardized across many jurisdictions with robust public art programs to implement something similar, including other Canadian cities like Toronto and Edmonton, as well as internationally when we look at Western Australia, Japan, and Paris. When it comes to the 96th Avenue project, it cost the city $43 million to complete, while the Beaufort Road interchange cost $71.7 million. And in this context, the price tags associated with the artwork located at these sites should be considered reasonable. Which is to say nothing about the aesthetic value that you get when you see them yourself, but the price tags themselves are based on internationally recognized best practice. Now, there's an additional part to this complaint when it comes to the fact that in the case of Ingus Day and Del Geist, these are not Calgarian artists. In fact, they're not even from Canada. And the idea is that they are being flown in from wherever they happen to be in the world, they're installing their projects, and then leaving with a lion's share of the money spent. And although there is legitimacy to the concern that we want local artists representing the local art in our communities, the fact remains that 80% of Travelling Light's budget and 90% of Bowfort Towers' budget stayed in Calgary in the local economy, going to local fabricators, workshops, and artists who are constructing these pieces of art. Point 2. Public art should be physically accessible. So now that we have an understanding of where Calgary gets its budget to both fund and maintain its public art collection, now we get to move on to the next section of the old public art policy, which stipulates where public art should be located in the city. The section states that the public art allocation will be used to develop public art specifically on the capital project site. So for those of you like me who were baffled by the decision to have a giant blue ring constructed on a relatively obscure overpass in the city's northeast, or why we had Bowfort Towers constructed by a highway where cars are zipping by at 100 kilometers an hour, well, this is why. And when it comes to Calgary specifically, we're a car-oriented North American city, meaning that a lot of our construction projects have the space to sprawl, and sprawl is what we do. So as a result, these projects have pretty high price tags, and the resulting art attached to it has high price tags as well, and they're quite flashy as a result of the previous policy. Now, there is an upshot to this insofar as you want people to be drawn to these new construction sites, and so long as you provide them in communities where people live, work, and play, there's value to having public art there so long as they actually enjoy the piece of artwork. The problem, though, is that if you take a utilitarian approach and decide to put all of your public art in the downtown core, then there's a deficit of public art in the suburbs and people who don't live downtown, and they either have to drive into the city or, God forbid, take public transit to experience public art. Point 3. Public art should be aesthetically accessible. Now, this is where things start to get interesting for me, because previously, where we talked about physical accessibility, it's pretty cut and dry. I mean, have public art where the public can enjoy it. But now we start to move into the realm of art being subjective, of beauty being in the eye of the beholder, of all of these turns of phrases that try to put into words what can only be understood through personal experience. And this is where your own personal interpretations and expectations of what public art should be come into play, because fundamentally, I think we all have an inkling of an idea that when we see public art, we want to feel good. At the very least, we don't want to feel bad. But beyond that, we don't really have a consensus on the role of public art in society. I mean, does it have an obligation or a duty to challenge fundamental beliefs and ideals? Let's work our way up to this question. Starting with one of my favorite pieces of public art in Calgary, an auspicious find by Lori Sobkovich. It's located in Prince's Island Park, and it's made of 15,000 glass marbles representing the native flora and fauna you're likely to encounter when walking through the park. Another favorite is Luminous Crossings by Cliff Garton, which has 20 total components built into the train stations on the east end of the 7th Avenue LRT at City Hall Station. The colors light up as the trains approach and depart the stations, and it's also functional, because it provides a visual marker for visitors to clearly identify the extent of the free fare zone through the downtown core. An auspicious find and Luminous Crossings are hardly controversial pieces of public art, nor are they particularly difficult, intellectually speaking, to sort out in our minds. But what are we to make of public artwork that doesn't fall so cleanly into categories like those? How do we evaluate art that defies clear definition? And perhaps more importantly, does it have a place in a city's public art collection? Well, let's see how the city of Calgary actually defines public art. We're going to be going into the city's newest public art policy and read verbatim their definition of public art. So apologies in advance, but it's important to actually understand the holistic nature of what they think constitutes public art. Public art has many definitions. It is sometimes defined by the artist, by the opportunity, or by constraints. In simple terms, it refers to art in public spaces and/or art intended for the public. Any public artwork can be experienced by different people in many different ways. Public art includes many types of art forms and mediums. Public art best practice is that the creation of a public artwork takes into consideration site and context as part of its process, be site-specific. But an artist might choose instead that the artwork is in contrast with its environment. If the public art is specific to its site and the site undergoes major change, then the public art should also change. Public art can be aesthetic, but it doesn't have to be. Public art may challenge ideas and beliefs. So public art should draw upon the physical environment as well as invoke the spirit of the place. And when you combine that with the public setting and interactive elements of public art, you start to get meaning. And when this is done well, you start to get public art that actually blends somewhat seamlessly into the environment and gets us to think about not just ourselves or our neighbors, but the environment around us, and perhaps tap into something even more universal. Under these conditions, Traveling Light and Bowfort Towers are both well-integrated and well-intentioned pieces of art. They are site-specific, evoke the physical location and history of their respective landmarks, and were invariably chosen with care by their artists. They were also approved by a local volunteer selection committee based on city policy. But they're bad pieces of public art because they're inaccessible both from a geographic standpoint as well as aesthetically. The 96th Avenue overpass and the Trans-Canada Highway simply offer zero opportunities for meaningful engagement with public art. And on an epistemic level, the fact that we refer to Traveling Light as a giant blue ring and we call Bowfort Towers a giant paperweight speaks to the foundational rejection we have for the artist's original intent. Good public art, therefore, needs to strike some balance between broad accessibility and meaningful commentary on place, with a lot of bad artwork leaning too heavily in one direction at the expense of the other. The selection committees behind these two pieces invariably looked at the international acclaim behind design studios like Ingus Ide and Del Geist, and looked at their portfolios ranging from cities across the world including Tokyo, Melbourne, and New York, and thought that implementing these pieces of art in Calgary would be an attractive ROI based on increased tourism and presenting Calgary as a cosmopolitan destination, unafraid to make grand statements about transportation and geology. You already know how this went. So where do we go from here? Well, in March 2021, the City of Calgary lifted its suspension on public arts funding, and even more than that, they transferred the public arts program in its entirety to Calgary Arts Development. Now, Calgary Arts Development is an external organization that is somewhat smaller than the municipal government, but is more embedded within the creative community here in Calgary, meaning that in practice we should get more responsiveness and more representation by local artists when it comes to how arts are administered and delivered in Calgary. The entire process is expected to take till 2024 to be complete, but that also hasn't stopped us from looking at the policy side. And when it comes to Calgary's corporate public art policy, the latest revision was in March of 2023. We still maintain the percent for public art allocation, but the stipulation that public art must be located on the site of capital projects has been changed, meaning that we should get pieces of public art that are located at sites that are more accessible to the average Calgarian. So that's that, the story of Calgary's public arts crisis in a nutshell. I'm really excited about the future of Calgary's public arts scene and really excited to get out there and experience it. But for those of you who remain skeptics, I see you and I hear you, but I do want to leave you with one point. Just because the policy has been changed and just because administration has changed hands doesn't mean that you're going to love every new piece of public artwork that comes from here on out. Negative pieces of artwork are always going to draw more attention than positive pieces, and unfortunately, that's just the cost of having a public arts programs, and it's not unique to Calgary. Every city with a public arts program has experienced some form of controversy. I have one last story for you, and it's about this group of 6.5 meter tall aluminium humans. Great Britain originally commissioned Spanish artist Mario Armengol to create 10 figures which would tower over the empire's gifts to the world, including the English language, Commonwealth government, and brown-colored food, all of which were proudly on display at the British Pavilion in the Montreal Expo in 1967. 1 year later, a businessman purchased the set at auction, and in 1968 ended up donating it to the city of Calgary for tax purposes. The funny thing though, was that no one had any idea about how to organize the figures when they were delivered, and so city staff ultimately set them up in the circular position where they stand today. Initial response to the structure was shock and appall and all manner of pearl clutching, but most Calgarians these days really love the piece. It's even the official logo for the Calgary Board of Education, whose offices are on the other end of the park.
I certainly can't predict how Calgarians might react to Travelling Light or Bowfort Towers 40 years from now, but the fact remains that these pieces of public art are here with us to stay, at least for the time being. And even if we don't learn to love them for what they are, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, we could at least appreciate them for what they meant at this point in time in Calgary's public art history. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is CJ. This has been my report to you, the shareholders, live from Treaty 7 territory. And until the next time, take care.